Well, thank you very much for inviting me to Rome. I'm very sorry that I will not be there. I had really wanted to be there and to talk to you about polyvagal theory and to, in part, explain the whole history of how polyvagal theory evolved and the importance of my interactions with the people in the somatic therapy world and how that has helped me find the importance of polyvagal theory in clinical practice. So if we go back many years ago, I met Peter Levine, and many of you know Peter Levine from his work with somatic experiencing. I knew Peter in the 1970s, long time ago, when he was starting to figure out how the body was related to trauma. He was very interested in trauma. And I was a young professor at the University of Illinois. And Peter wanted me to explain to him why and how the autonomic nervous system went into kind of a shutting down response. And we had all been trained with an understanding that our major defense system was a fight-flight system. So when Peter was observing in his clients that they were almost passing out or shutting down, and that their autonomic nervous system was functionally turning off. So Peter was very interested in how the autonomic nervous system shut down and was in a great conflict because we had all learned about the defenses of the autonomic nervous system as being fight, flight, and high sympathetic activation. And that created a great challenge. And this was in the late 1970s that I met Peter. And I was kind of really interested in what he proposed, but I was not a trauma therapist, and I was a laboratory scientist. And so these ideas about how the autonomic nervous system responded to trauma were put aside for another decade. And I was working with newborn babies, and I was observing that newborn babies, especially those born prematurely, were at high risk. Those babies often had bradycardias, where their heart rates went too slow to support sufficient oxygenization or oxygen for their brains, and they stopped breathing. These were called apneas and bradycardia, and they're potentially life-threatening for preterm babies. And I was very confused with that because I thought those systems appeared to be linked to a vagal system, yet vagal activity up to that point was viewed as protective. And in 1992, I wrote a paper in a journal of pediatrics where I described heart rate variability as a protective indicator for high-risk babies. And the heart rate variability was an index of this vagal regulation. That article resulted in a letter from a pediatrician. And that pediatrician said that when he was in medical school, he learned that the vagus could kill you. And what he was talking about the bradycardias and apneas that I observed. And those were also vagal. So now we were caught in this intellectual and important question was how could the vagus be protective? And how could the vagus be potentially lethal and kill you? And the answer, and this is where polyvagal theory emerged. Polyvagal theory emerged from the understanding that there were two different vagal pathways, and they came from different parts of the brain. They had different functions. They went to different places. And what polyvagal theory explained was that they not only were phylogenetically different, meaning they evolved at different stages, but that our early development, like during the period of time of gestation and for the preterm baby, these systems came in sequentially. And if you were born too early, you didn't have a protective vagal system and your body reacted in defense with shutting down. So by 1994, I had conceptualized the polyvagal theory, which really explained that we had two different vagal circuits and our autonomic nervous system reacted to challenges in a hierarchy that reflected our evolutionary transitions, so that the most evolutionarily ancient vertebrates had this unmyelinated older vagal circuit, and when they were challenged, didn't have enough food or didn't have enough oxygen, they would stop breathing and reduce their heart rate. And in fact, reptiles still do this, and this immobilization or inanimate behavior is a primary characteristic of a reptilian defense response. But as vertebrates evolved, they started to expand on the complexity of the neural circuits that could regulate the autonomic nervous system. And they had a spinal sympathetic nervous system that enabled mobilization and fighting behavior, and it provided, in many of the organs, a way of the autonomic nervous system both having an inhibitory or vagal and an excitatory or sympathetic system. It's at the time of the transition from reptiles to mammals that the polyvagal theory really becomes important, and it becomes important in terms of our understanding of clinical conditions, because at the transition from reptiles to mammals, mammals needed to coexist, they needed to co-regulate. They weren't born with sufficient development to take care of themselves, and they needed to interact with each other to regulate their physiology. And what happened with evolution is that the structures involved in social communication, meaning our voice, our facial expression, those structures became integrated in the brainstem with a newer myelinate vagus. And that myelinate vagus served to contain and protect the rest of our body to enable the sympathetic and the old vagal circuits to support our homeostasis. So now we go back in time to looking at the preterm baby, and we start looking at the clinical cases that Peter Levine identified. When we look at the preterm baby, what we see is a nervous system that does not have the new mammalian myelinate vagus, so it's very vulnerable to defenses and reactivity. So preterm babies are tachycardic, their heart rates go fast, and if that doesn't work to make them safer, their bodies will go into an immobilization or a death feigning, a response of reducing metabolic output like a reptile. Except for a preterm baby, this could be potentially lethal. And when Peter described the traumatic or the traumatized adults, it was the same thing. It was as if their bodies attempted to disappear, to be inanimate, to pretend to be dead. But those conditions don't support health. So what we start to learn over time, or I start to learn, was that the polyvagal theory provided an understanding of the experiences that many people had when they were traumatized. So what trauma did to those individuals was first, when they were confronted with a challenge, their nervous system could have gone into a fight or flight, but in many situations that would not be effective. And so the nervous system made an evaluation, and it made that evaluation on a reflexive level without cognitive awareness through a process that I now call neuroception, and immediately tried to protect the body by shutting down. So the history of the polyvagal theory really is a history I've worked over the years trying to figure out the neural mechanisms of the autonomic nervous system. And as I discovered these ideas or discovered these pathways and mechanisms, to my, I use the term surprise, and to my sense of having done something that will be helpful to humanity, I start to learn that this provided a very functional explanation of the experiences of many individuals who had survived trauma. So the issue was to understand this neurophysiology that changed with evolution and with development, and how that information provided an understanding of the experiences of people who were survivors of trauma. And it also provided portals or windows of understanding of how interventions could work. So on the first level, it provided a narrative in which people who survived trauma were able to see their body's reactions not as being victims, but as being heroic, in the sense saving their lives. And the second part is that the theory provided an understanding that there are portals, places in which the nervous system becomes vulnerable to interventions, so that we can literally reawaken the neural organization of the autonomic nervous system by enabling the body to feel safe. And those of you who do body therapies understand intuitively exactly what I'm saying. Now, unfortunately, I am not there to share and join you in this wonderful meeting, but you are fortunate to have the opportunity to hear Deb Dana speak. Deb is a very talented and intuitive therapist, and Deb has figured out how to translate many of the concepts and constructs from polyvagal theory into therapies that will be helpful to people who have experienced trauma. And I sit back in awe and watch as Deb talks about the ideas that I outlined, and then I see them come to life in her presentations and in the work that she does. So I hope you really enjoy and have an opportunity to interact with Deb. So that is my introduction, and I welcome you to the conference.